This is CheloniaCast, episode 74. Today we are joined by Dr. Paul Stone, who's a professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Central Oklahoma. Dr. Stone has done an immense amount of work with turtles and turtle ecology, conservation, with an emphasis on a lot of sort of longer term assemblage dynamics and sort of population analyses. Really excited to talk to him about some of his adventures in the field and his research and what he's learned through the years of working with these awesome animals. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Stone, we usually like to preface these episodes with the same question to kind of get the ball rolling. What got you interested in turtles and tortoises in the first place?
Well, I think many herpetologists have the same answer to this, and it's like this boyhood fascination with herps, and a lot of it starts with snakes, and it did with me when I was like 8. My parents moved us to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and there weren't as many people, and there were snakes all over the place, and I really started catching snakes with these kids, and when those kids got bored with snakes, I started catching snakes with other kids, and I caught snakes until off and on when I was a kid, and then I went to college. I was always going to work on herps. It was going to be snakes, but then when I got to Auburn for my master's, it was um, the kinds of things that really interested me required large sample sizes, and so I just kind of shifted from snakes to turtles because snakes are so hard to find and they're so hard to do the kinds of stuff that I want to do. But turtles are perfect for it. So I just moved to turtles right then and stuck with them mostly.
Early on, you did some really interesting work that was kind of similar to some of the things that Dr. William Dunson put out, some of the cutaneous
Mhm.
respiration and looking at the respiratory dynamics of turtles. That's some really interesting work. I'm curious what sort of pushed you in that direction, and some of them, what it was like to collect some metrics, like calculating the surface area of the skin. I mean, what kind of goes into that?
Yeah. Well, what got me started there was I was an early graduate student at Auburn, and I was taking like a physiological ecology class, and we were doing a class project, and I bumped into papers by Dunson and Bob Gatton, Dan Belkin. These guys had all done that. Dan Belkin, especially, had put a Stenotherus minor in his classroom underwater where it had no access for air for like a whole semester. And it was like hyper oxygenated water. And so it was getting all of its oxygen across its skin. I just thought that was remarkable. And I never heard of that. And so I did a little pilot study for my class project, and it worked out real well. And I don't think we measured surface area particularly well because we didn't want to kill turtles to do it. And so I tried to measure it in 2 dimensions with a Xerox machine. And I thought I had a pretty decent um, estimate of, the differences between these 3 species I was working on. And then right at the last minute, like our last committee meeting before I turned in my thesis, one of the committee members said, that's no good. You need to skin some turtles. And so I remember the last thing I did for my master's was go into the museum, and I skinned like, I don't remember how many, but a few Eastern mud turtles, a few stink pots. And I think because soft shell turtles were so flat, I convinced them that I didn't really need to skin one. They were almost 2 dimensional. And um, it was challenging. The better way to do it would be to skin live turtles, but of course you got to kill turtles, and killing turtles is hard to do because they live so long. It seems like such a cheap way to die.
Right. And so you found with that first study at least that there was sort of the correlation between the amount of exchange that's going on and that cutaneous surface area, which I guess is it almost seems logical, but maybe it's not the case. So it's interesting to look at that. Um, some of the stuff that was raised by Dunson and others early on was just the question of what other factors influence the sort of aquatic respiration. if it's occurring, like skeletal mass and those sort of things. I mean, did you kind of get at those questions too, or did that come later, or what is your take on that?
Well, I think, you know, the main thing that's going to drive your ability to do aquatic respiration is going to be, well, there's a couple of things. One of them is going to be your body size. So if you're big, like a common snapping turtle, um, you're just too big, and your skin is going to have to be real thick and, you know, relatively, I would think, impermeable to oxygen, and you know, you're just too big. You got lots of surface area, but you're too big. So a soft shell turtle is, you know, very different because its entire body's permeable to oxygen. It's a fairly thin membrane. It's got a lot of skin, and it's got uptake across that cartilage. Probably not as much as the skin. It's also got throat, the potential for you know, some bucopharyngeal uptake, so it can be big. It's the only one really, I think, that can be real big and still take a lot of stuff up across its skin. And then, you know, the mud turtles and the musk turtles have a lot more surface area than mud turtles, and mud turtles just really don't have much surface area for aquatic breathing, right? But stink pots do. They have a lot of, you know, right there along their plastron. The bridge is real open, and so I think if you're small, like like a kinosternid, and you have a fairly good amount of surface area, then and the other big thing is whether the water's oxygenated or not. So like a stream is a lot better than a pond. A stream is pretty close to saturated with oxygen. So you imagine a stink pot or a loggerhead musk turtle or something up there in a stream that's got good flow. They're going to be getting quite a bit of oxygen out of the water. But an eastern mud turtle in an old farm pond is not gonna it's not gonna be that important to it.
Right, it cares more about just being able to hide and get food and that sort of thing. It can kind of breathe the air. I've with the soft shells, I'm curious what you think about this. It wasn't maybe necessarily something you analyzed directly, but if they're breathing through the skin, I mean that body plan also is pretty hydrodynamic and affords them some efficiency with locomotion. But I'm curious if you think evolutionarily, maybe just speculation on it, whether the skin breathing was the adaptation that led to that body plan, or if it was maybe the ability to avoid predators or another thing that shaped the soft shell initially.
Well, when I think of the soft shell, you know, I think of these farmers in Oklahoma who, you know, not just Oklahoma, everywhere. I think farmers and fishermen think that, you know, red-eared sliders are eating bass, and I just laugh at that and say, you know, that's impossible. But you know, the two turtles that I think could really catch a fish are just the alligator snapping turtle with its lure. You know, might catch a few fish, but softshell turtles are really good hunters. They're fast and they're streamlined, like you said, and I think they're you know, pretty good ambush predators, but they can also put a move on you. And so I always think of them as being driven by this hydrodynamic body plan that allows them to be real fast underwater, so they can chase down a fish or chase down a whatever. And then I would think that the cutaneous respiration followed, you know, as they were streamlining and losing that bone. You know, they're so light relative to a turtle that size because of their loss of that bone. I think they're hunters.
Right, for kind of first away, and then maybe that gets co-opted later on to assist with just extracting oxygen and becoming more efficient.
Yeah, I think maybe it's hard to say, of course, but to me, you know, their big difference between them and a lot of other turtles is how fast they are as swimmers, how good they are at swimming. You know, they're really fast. And you know, have you ever tried to catch one underwater? They're tough. You know, they're compared to a slider.
Yeah, we both Wyatt and I and some of the other guys that help co-host or do a lot of stuff volunteering working with the Santa Fe River Turtle Project, and
Okay, yeah,
they've got a lot of soft shells at the study sites there, and it's I'd say 50% of the time it ends in frustration, that
yeah,
it's gone and you can't get it. They're too
yeah. And
fast.
if you give it a fair chance, it's gone. You got to be kind of half lucky, to get kind of corner one. But anyways, yeah. So, but I don't know. I mean, I think they're in a branch of the turtle tree that um, is, pretty far removed from they break off pretty early, right after the side necks. I think the next big break includes the soft shell. So I think they're old school turtles, and I think they did that a long time ago.
Yeah, right. Yeah, just a mix of different factors that sort of led to that shape. And with the this initial study you did, looking at the differences in the aquatic respiration, I think you kind of followed that up with diving and breathing patterns.
Mhm.
I'm just curious what kind of led you to look at it, that kind of get at the same question of what's the proportion of time that's uh, the proportion of usage of aquatic respiration effectively. I think that's kind of the right way to look at it, but get at that with a different question of how does the diving behavior differ?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. One is that Dan Belkin had that turtle down on his desk. That really affected me, and I thought, well, the second thing is just I'm often just want to know like basic natural history information, like what do things eat, how long do they live, how big do they get, and in case of a turtle, how long does it stay down? It just seems like a really fundamental question that like a kid would ask, right? Like, how long does that thing stay underwater? And for some reason, I like little simple questions like that. And so I was filming these turtles. Well, I decided to film them, kind of just to make sure everything was working, right? And I could see their when they breathe. I could see them coming up, and then I could see, we just put a little capillary tube with a drop of oil in it, and whenever they breathed, it was an airtight chamber that the little bubble of oil would move, and so you could count the breaths on the video, and um, it seemed like just a reasonable thing to do to find out how long these turtles stayed underwater. And then, with that simple little adjustment, we could tell how many breaths they took each time. And where I was wondering, I guess getting at like if I hyperoxygenated the water, would the soft shell turtles ever come up to breathe? And the answer was almost no. They would come up like, very rarely to breathe. And the other turtles changed too. I think if I remember right, the stink pots stayed down longer too. But the soft shells really dramatically stayed down longer. And um, it was interesting. I think it's worthwhile to have a reasonable average dive time in normoxia, where the water level's normal. How long do these three species stay down? I think that's the kind of little natural history nugget that's worthwhile. And then the other really cool thing there was that every soft shell turtle, no matter how much oxygen was in the water, I think every single time, if my memory serves correctly, they took one breath, exactly one breath, and went back down. They never stuck their head up. They stuck their head up sometimes for, you know, 30, 40 seconds, but that whole time was always one breath and then back down, which was kind of fun.
Yeah, maybe they didn't even need to come up. They just kind
Right.
of figured,
Just
"Okay, let's
let me
test."
look around, see what it looks like out here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's awesome. And so some of your other work that you did at Auburn was centered around the university ponds there and the work in the field. I'm curious what that was like. I mean, to go out, we've spoken with people that worked at many different field labs but not at the Auburn station. And so I'm curious just what it was like doing research there. What were some of the challenges inherent to the landscape? And
Well, it was, it was just these old two farm ponds that were out on some acreage. I don't remember how big it was, but two good sized ponds. And there was no other activity out there. There wasn't a research station there or any kind of other people studying at the time. And so it was just me and Brian Haig, who you may know from that Santa Fe study. We were grad students, and I can't remember exactly the motivation, but we got motivated to. I remember the motivation. There was a PhD student who had worked out at these ponds in the early 70s, and this was the late 80s, and we were under the same major professor, and he said, somebody needs to get out there and look at those ponds and see what's going on. And we had this nice data set from the early 70s, and so we went out there, and it was really interesting because we were the only people there. It was just these two ponds. We had a drift fence around one, and we trapped intensively in both of them. And for a couple of years, and it was just me and Brian, and it was our first real field study. And we had to scramble up for money for bait, and I think Craig Geyer bought money for the drift fence and gave us, the hoop nets and things. And it was really fun. It was my first turtle study, and I was doing side by side that diving experiment. And that was my thesis, the diving experiments, and this was our side project. And I never did another lab experiment after that. I farmed them out. I collaborated with a few people on lab experiments, but I never did another lab experiment. That was the last one because I had that contrast, and I just enjoyed the field work a lot more than the lab work. And the next time I had a choice, field work or lab work, field work. I've always took field work after that.
That's awesome. And what was it like putting up the drift fence? Did you guys have to actually go around the pond and?
Yeah, this was a great big pond. I can't remember the dimensions. I think the fence was 600 meters or something, roughly, and it was a lot of work, more work than we thought it was going to be. Not only to put it in, but then to monitor it. And we had certainly been warned, if you put a drift fence in, you've got to check it every day, or else you have to put lids on. And not so much in the winter. It's like once a week, and nothing's ever in there. But in the summer, you have to check it every day. And same with hoop nets, especially if it rains. You got to rush out there and avoid drowning turtles. And that was our first exposure to that. Kind of the discipline required. Building it was just like a week long hard work. And I'd worked before, and it wasn't anything that weird, but the checking that fence every day, it was like required discipline. I had to ride my bicycle out there a few times because my car was broken down, and it was just a real challenge to every day either Brian or I or both of us had to go check that drift fence. And I learned a lot about repeating your delivery during that study.
Yeah, good just the work ethic type stuff. I mean, that's cool. With respect to the turtles, it seemed like there was one pond that had a bit more like fertilizer influence, more urban almost, and another one that hadn't changed, or that one treatment had been removed. I don't recall exactly. It's been a while, but just kind of an interesting dynamic between the two ponds. And it seemed like that not a lot changed except for the common musk turtles. That population shifted a lot. Curious what you think sort of led to that. Why was it just the musk turtles?
Well, so I think, argument in the paper, and I think I still stick with that. I think it was our first argument that we made in the literature, pretty much, and we were, I think, perhaps overstated what was going on. I think that's a young writer's tendency, but I think it might hold true. I don't know that anybody's followed it up, but those were fairly young ponds in the 70s, and I can't remember, one was a little older than the other, but my memory is that they were both fairly young ponds, and they had a bunch of eastern mud turtles in them, but not too many stink pots. And our argument was that the eastern mud turtle was two things: better at finding a new pond, and also better at living in a fairly young pond, and not as good at living in a permanent pond as a stink pot. And that what had happened over time was that the stink pots had, taken them a while to get a foothold, but these were permanent ponds. They never went dry. They had fish in them, and they were slightly better habitat for stink pots than eastern mud turtles. And the mud turtles were more, less fish, more, okay with drying out, and stink pots, a little more tolerant of fish, and liked the permanent better. And I think that's still true. The thing I've learned over the years is that, the other turtle that is capable of finding a pond fast is a slider. Sliders move around a tremendous amount. I think that's one of their secrets to success. They're just all over the landscape looking for new ponds, I guess. And I still think that about mud turtles too, that they're really ready to go. If, they don't like where they're at, they're ready to go and find a new place. And I think stink pot's a lot less likely. Snapping turtles a lot less likely too.
That's interesting. With the species that you noticed there that sort of would colonize the ponds over time, what do you think led to the sort of how they pinpointed those ponds? What were they using? I mean, do you have ideas about that?
Well, I think the main idea I've learned over time is that most of this moving happens when it's real wet. And, we studied slider moving in Oklahoma pretty intensively. And turtles live so long, part of it is that they know, like they know that over that hill and down that, gully is a pond, and they've been there before, and they know what it's like, and they'll go back there the next time they think it's time to go. So that a normal slider will have, I don't know how many ponds in its neighborhood, but in Oklahoma, maybe 4, 5, 6 ponds that it visits on a yearly basis. And I don't know why they do that. Part of the way they find it is because they remember, and I don't know if part of it's just dumb luck. I'm just going to stagger out this way and hope for the best. There's a lot of farm ponds in the world, and they can truck for a while without getting in trouble. Mud turtles, we'll eventually talk about the New Mexico mud turtles that I study, and they make the craziest moves over ridges, like where there's no way you could smell or see water. And they go over ridges, take walks that humans would complain about. And I don't know why in the world they do it, or, I think sliders, I know what they do is they're in a permanent pond when it's real dry, and then when it rains and the little ephemeral ponds fill up, they scatter to those ephemeral ponds because there's going to be all these insects in those ephemeral ponds because there's no fishes. I'm pretty positive that's what sliders are doing. And then, but in terms of finding a new pond, who finds a new pond and how they figure out that pond is there, I think that's still a pretty fun question.
Yeah, right. What's leading to it? I mean, so the polarization sensitivity maybe, but like what you're saying makes a lot of sense of just there's enough ponds in the landscape, maybe just go in a certain direction and you're going to find one.
Yeah. Out in Oklahoma, I think I've read some estimate. I don't know who did it, but there are 300,000 farm ponds in Oklahoma. And if you go on Google Earth and zoom in on any square mile, there's 4 or 5 farm ponds. And so I think in the landscape, it's wetter in back east, and so you'll hit a creek pretty quick if you start walking.
Well, you mentioned the work you're doing with Sonoran mud turtles. Maybe we could go to that because that's sort of, I mean, a very long-term study. Now you've got at least 3 decades worth of data. Is that correct?
Yeah, 31st year we finished.
Wow. Well, it's yeah. I mean, the things you've been able to see and the changes over time within years, within chunks of years, that sort of thing. It is really interesting. And maybe we could just kind of get off where we were talking about with the movement ecology and how these Sonoran mud turtles deal with the drying of habitat that occurs
Yeah.
in the desert where you're looking at them.
Yeah, they're really remarkable. So the main canyon where we started, and we have been every year, usually twice a year, it's called Blackwater Canyon, and we started trapping there in 1994. And that thing has had around 2009, the dam broke. Well, back up a couple of years. 2006, there was a wildfire on the slopes above Blackwater Canyon. And when that happens, there's a lot of soot and ash and silt that washes in. So it took about, I don't know, half or a third of the tank filled up with ash. Um, and then a couple of years later, the dam broke. This catch plate on the dam poked a hole. It's this big metal plate. And so that pond was dry or nearly dry for 3 years. It would fill up when it rained and then immediately start draining through the plate. And we calculated or estimated it'd be about 6 weeks before it would be dry again. And so for 3 years, it had almost no water. We ended up getting it fixed. And once it was fixed, it filled back up. We started catching turtles and couldn't tell that there had ever been a problem. The turtles were fine with close to dry for 3 years. Um, it's been like that the last couple of years, just from drought, like in, I think, 22, 23, 24. We've seen it wet one time in 6 visits. And, but the same thing, the canyon was wet this August and we caught 40, 50 turtles and they were all looking good, and so they can survive with just very little water. And I think when they don't have access to water, they're just climbing up on the side of the canyons and estivating. I don't think that's, I think there's a limit at some point, and I think they're approaching that limit. It's been dry 5 of the last 6 times we visited this tank, and when it rains, there's lots of pools available in the canyons and such, and the turtles are getting in there and eating and getting out and surviving. I think if it continues to get hotter and continues to get drier, there's a point where there'll be a problem. But they're remarkable in their resilience. Like they just hang on and they do fine. And some of them leave and hunt down new waters. Some of them just climb up on the side of the hill and wait for it to rain.
How is it? I think that you've sort of at least helped with some of these laboratory experiments that look at in a state of sort of aestivation, dormancy, that sort of thing, what the physiological changes are that occur. Because I imagine you just blood volume has to change and the concentration of solutes and nutrients has to change. I mean, how do they offset those potential negative impacts?
Well, I think behaviorally, I think, and this was a student that did his thesis, Day Ligon, and he was from OSU, and so he had a physiologist who Chuck Peterson, who was his advisor, and the three of us kind of conspired on this. And this is what I was saying earlier. I never did lab work again. I worked with Chuck Peterson, but Chuck Peterson and Day did the lab work, and I was just the person who knew where the turtles were. That's who I've tried to become, and it worked this time. They did good work. And I think the upshot of it is that you close your shell. So Northern mud turtles can close their shell pretty good, and you just hunker down and you lower your heart rate and you don't spend any energy. you have a pretty good closure of your shell, and there's a study that showed that that lowers your water loss a lot, being able to close your shell like that. And then they just hunker down. And at first, they if they have a full bladder, they can claim that water back and keep their plasma going. I can't remember, how good they are at doing that, but they're basically just trying to hold their plasma solutes below the danger point. And I think what they would do is go in and take blood every so often, every week or something. They were looking for this danger point, this solute concentration at which it starts challenging you. And I can't remember, the details of that. And I think that they found, I can't remember the days either. I think it was something like, 10 weeks or something, but my memory is faulty. Um, and that was the point when they pulled them out that they thought that their plasma solute concentration started looking like it was getting dangerous for them.
It's just fascinating to think about that an aquatic turtle has become so physiologically capable of dealing with extreme habitats like that. I mean, you go out in the desert as a large mammal and think, I wouldn't survive here without water for more than a few days if I was stuck. It's incredible. They can go years.
Yeah, well, this place is like, we go in the dry season in May or June, and we go in the wet season in August, July or August, and there's just a stark contrast. So it's everything that lives out there. There's just this tremendous give. It's like the winter and summer, but it's the dry and the hot, or the dry and the wet. And you go out there in the dry season, and all the grass is brown, and there's not many lizards or birds. Everybody's kind of hunkered down, and then you go out there in August, and there's flowers and birds, and the grass is green. So every creature out there, birds and or plants and animals, are adapted to this cycle of get everything you can in the brief monsoon season, and then just hold your oats until the next one. And the turtles are no different. They're the only species of turtle though out there, so it's super challenging to be a turtle and to be out there. It's not there. I don't have any fear that they're going to introduce another species of turtle from the eastern United States that's going to succeed out there. Even sliders, I don't think would make it out there. There's just not enough water.
They dry up, right? What the water dynamics are very interesting in the southwestern deserts generally. During the 2022 Turtle Survival Symposium, we made a road trip down south to look for the Arizona mud turtles, and I'm sure the dynamics in that region are a little bit different than where you're working on kind of the border of New Mexico, Arizona, but overall maybe similar. And when we were there in August, the same time that we went back, it was full of water, one of the tanks. Whereas we went this year and all the tanks in the region were dry except for one. And I just found that strange because if anything, we were a little bit more in the wet portion of the year than we were the time we went in 2022. And so what are some of what's driving how those tanks dry and sort of refill? I mean, what is that?
Well, it's complicated. I think in the Palancios, and I think a lot of places out in the Southwest, it will rain like cats and dogs in one canyon, and just a mile away in the next canyon not get a drop. And so there's a lot of just patchiness to the rain. I was at we ate at a restaurant up there in Rodeo, New Mexico, which is about 20 miles away from Animas, New Mexico. And the lady in the restaurant told us that they hadn't had a drop of water yet. This was like August 10th or so. And she said, they're saying over in Animas, if it rains again, they don't know if they can handle it because of the flooding. And this is 20 miles away. And so that's part of it. another part of it is fires just like um, destroy the hydrology of the area. So we had a big fire in our study area a couple of years ago, and there's so much soot and ash in these canyons now. When it rains, even if it would flow, create a gully washer, all that water's just stuck in the ash. And so what, we had a rain this trip that would have, I think, and a friend of mine that was out there thought that the creek would have flowed for 3 days after that rain, and the creek didn't flow because of all the ash and silt that were trapped. So, then the longer term thing is that it's just hotter now than it has been. And so in 31 years, we've seen that it's just hotter now than it used to be. We have this old instructions for students, like camping tips that say, it gets really cold at night, you better bring a thermal and a hat and a nice sleeping bag. And I deleted that recently because it's just not true anymore. It really doesn't get cold at night in the tents anymore. And the other part of that is it's just drought after drought after drought. There was no monsoon season in 2023. It never rained, until late September, which was, pretty much too late for everybody probably. Um, so, the climate change with the heat and the drought and the, fires, which are also related to climate change. The other part of it, not what you're talking about. What you're talking about, I think, is covered by that. The patchiness of the rain. It was raining in Tucson a lot, and there were lots of herps out, but it has to get enough to be a gully washer to fill those tanks up. And the first couple of rains are going to just saturate the ground, right? So you have to get the ground saturated, and then the rain is going to wash into the gullies, and that has to be enough to fill a tank up. And so it was like that this summer in the Palencia. It was wet everywhere, but the tanks hadn't filled yet because it just hadn't had the right gully washer.
That's really interesting. It takes a certain critical mass to just get things kind of moving, and then you can actually fill the system. Interesting. When it comes to there's been some work, especially now with that's come up in recent years with modeling of future dynamics of turtles, and some of this has been done on mud turtles and shown that climate for desert species may not be as big of an issue as we think. I mean, I'm curious if you agree with that or disagree, because you're looking at it at a scale that's very different than someone that's got a computer that can project, and I think there's pluses and minuses of all of it, but I'm curious what your take is on that.
Well, I think, I am an old dog, and it's hard to teach an old dog new tricks. And I think those models are useful. I think they're young, and I think in 20 years we might say, boy, I can't believe we used to do modeling like that. But I think they're telling us now what they're telling us. And I don't know. I think the Keenesternid models that I've seen say Sonoriensis range is not much likely to change because of climate change. I think my experience on the ground in Palencios is it's definitely getting hotter. It's definitely getting drier. The thing that, doesn't go into the models is partly what I was just talking about, like what happens if there's a fire that's climate related and then changes the hydrology of the system. But then the other thing to me that I started really worrying about, about 20 years ago, almost 15 years ago, is that a lot of the water in the Palencios and many of the Sky Islands is these impoundments that, dams that have been put across canyons that fill up. Almost all of the turtles in our study area are centered around some impoundment like that. 100 years ago, there weren't impoundments, but there were natural springs, and almost all of the springs have been capped off and turned into wells and drinkers for cattle. or they've been dug out and turned into big impoundments. Well, those impoundments are failing, and the Palencios, like over half of them, are broken or they're filled with silts. The dam leaks or something or another, and so I worry in the Palencios, and I think other ranges in the Sky Islands as well. Um, if they're not on an active cattle lease and the dam breaks, the Forest Service really doesn't do anything. They don't really have the resources to fix every dam that breaks, and over half of the dams in my study area are broken, and so I foresee a time when they're all broken because they're built by humans and they need to be maintained by humans, and if they're not maintained, then they break. And if they break, then there's no springs and there's no impoundments. That means there's no permanent water. And there's without permanent water, turtles are tough, but they're not permanently tough. They're going to need to hydrate at some point, and it's becoming harder and harder to hydrate. Not all because of climate change, but a lot of the climate change kind of exacerbates it all. What it is fundamentally is just aquatic habitat loss because of fires, siltation, and failure of these human-made structures. But climate change just makes it harder and harder to deal with that.
Right, and I mean, it to some extent, you don't necessarily need to lose the aquatic habitat per se to lose the turtles. There's a certain critical period where if you push that estivation too long, the population may wipe out.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. We've had no monsoon last year, as I said, and it happened to be a really good year for reproduction the year before that and the year before that. And so we have all of these baby turtles that were marked in 2021, 2022, and then 2023, no monsoon happens. And so no monsoon happens, and that means very few hatchlings from last year survive. They come out right at the beginning of the monsoon. If the monsoon doesn't come, then the hatchlings are coming out and there's no water. So we caught just a handful of hatchlings from last year this year. It also puts a stress on the females to have no monsoon, so they gather the resources to survive the winter and to make eggs next summer in the monsoon. And so no monsoon means not enough resources to make eggs. We saw very few hatchlings this year, and most distressingly, of the little guys that we'd already marked in the previous 2 years that we caught this year, several of them hadn't grown even a millimeter in a whole year, and a couple of them had lost a few grams of mass. And that's like the 2 or 3 best years of growth in your life if you're a turtle, or your first 2 or 3 years, right? And so these are turtles that were 1 year old and now they're 2 year old and they haven't grown a bit. And they're just little old skinny turtles that are just barely hanging on. So if you miss one monsoon, it affects 3 classes of turtles, right? The next year's hatchlings, this year's hatchlings, and especially last year's hatchlings. So it's, how many times can you do that without, caving in the population?
Right. When it comes to the hatchlings, that's another thing in itself is, I mean, how do you find them? Is there a difference in habitat or
Yeah. So the hatchlings are all in pools, and we always find them by hand, and they're really easy to spot. They're little, I mean, they're tiny, so you have to develop a search image, but they live in shallow pools, and these shallow pools are filled with tadpoles during the monsoon, and they're also filled with aquatic insects and aquatic invertebrates. So it's a perfect little nursery for hatchlings because there's plenty to eat. It's also a perfect little nursery for black-necked garter snakes. There's all these little baby black-necked garter snakes down there doing the same thing, eating tadpoles and aquatic invertebrates. And in the tanks, you never find hatchlings. Our nets are too big to catch hatchlings, but we have sampled aquatic invertebrates, and we've been at the shores of tanks, hundreds of times, and we never catch hatchlings in the with dip nets or with looking at them. We think there's the aquatic insects are too big in the impoundments. There are things like the bellostomatid beetles and lots of diving beetles. We think maybe the invertebrates eat the hatchlings, and possibly the adults might eat the hatchlings. But hatchlings are always found in these little pools. The adults are found in the pools too, but often in the impoundments. So yeah, and I think without if the monsoon fails, you don't get the pools. So there's no place for the hatchlings to go.
Right. So sort of like satellite habitats from the main tanks and
Yeah.
and found interesting.
Yeah, that's what we think is the best habitat in our study area is an impoundment that has an extensive run of canyon pools above it or below it, and we think that that's um, going to provide good habitat for hatchlings. The adults go down to these canyon pools too because they're full of, like I said, of stuff to eat.
Right. And so your study is unique in that you've got at least one section had an incredible density of turtles, and 2,800 per hectare was one of the estimates. And that's, I mean, what are the implications? I mean, why is it that at different sites you see such a wide variation in the number in the biomass? And I guess B would be, what's the implication for the ecosystem with that many turtles?
Yeah. So part of it, so if you estimate population density, it's the number of turtles divided by the amount of aquatic habitat. And so those really high densities are not necessarily um, what it sounds like. There's not 2,800 turtles in the population, right? But because there's not a hectare of habitat. So, there might be like 0.1 hectares of habitat, and there's a lot of turtles. We've pulled 45 turtles out of a thing about the size of my desk here, just a pool of water, but it was the only pool of water in the canyon. And, for some reason, the turtles were all thirsty at the same time. So they were all down there drinking. Um, so I think those estimates are a little bit sensational, right? They're not real. And I think one way to look at it is how many total adults are in the population. And so in Blackwater Canyon, there's I don't know 200 adult turtles, and at some point there's only like 1 square meter of habitat. So, but it's kind of faking it to say there's 2,000 turtles per square meter of habitat because none of them are in that 1 square meter. They're all up on the land estivating. Um, Jeff Lovich has done this really good work on the effect of turtle biomass on ecosystems, and it's pretty strong. So you get like a situation in Oklahoma where you got 600 sliders in a 2 hectare pond, and they're having a big effect. They're eating a lot of food and creating a lot of turtle poop. That's a lot of biomass. So turtle biomass is a big thing, and I think even in these canyons with these turtles, um, they're the top aquatic predator in the system, right? They're the heaviest aquatic organism in these canyons. They're not very big, right? They're this big. They weigh 300 grams is a really big one in our study area, but that's the biggest thing in there by far, right? So they have a kind of a top predator effect on their ecosystem.
Right, moving around a lot of nutrients and that sort of thing. Um, Something just in looking for Arizona mud turtles, I'm also looking for Sonoran mud turtles. Is in these tanks, they can be there can be a lot of them, but they can be surprisingly hard to hand capture because they're so good at hiding in the mud and that sort of thing. But I'm curious why is that your experience with hand capture of them? I mean, I'm assuming you're trapping mostly, but
Well, we've got about half of our captures are by trap and about half are by hand. And
Oh,
this
well.
last trip, I never set a net because it was all flood risk, and the tanks were mostly dry, and the tanks that had water looked like a flood could wash my nets away. So we did it all by hand. And if it's more than knee deep, you're not going to catch many turtles. But if it's less than knee deep, and depends on what's on the bottom. If the bottom is all rocky, they're going to be able to hide pretty good. And I always worry about tipping rocks and trapping turtles, but if it's a muddy bottom and it's knee deep or less, you can do pretty good. If it's much deeper than that, they just move around, they just kind of move around as you're trying to get them. But, if it's, especially if the water's clear, we think, and it's contained in a fairly small pool, we think we get most of the turtles.
And you've seen a interesting phenomenon, this terrestrial flight response where they leave the water. Maybe you could expand on that and how you studied that.
Yeah, it was really interesting. Dave Ligon, who was a student I mentioned earlier, put radios on turtles. And as he put the radios on, he came back in a couple days to find them. He couldn't find them, and they were gone. He lost his turtles for like a week. And what they'd done, they'd all left the water and climbed up on land and were estivating. And so this was when we really discovered that they estivated on land. This was the first, real demonstration of that. Well, I think a year later or so, Day caught a bunch of turtles with a student, and the student had some heat stroke, or not heat stroke, but was a little hot. And so they caught some turtles, measured them, let them go. And this student stayed up under the willow tree to cool down while Day went down the canyon to explore or something. And she saw turtles leaving the pond, and Day mentioned it in his field notes. And then my wife and I saw that same phenomenon several years later. And 20 turtles, we caught a bunch of turtles, put them back in the pond, ate lunch, and as we were eating lunch, turtles just started leaving the pond, climbing up the hill. What in the world's going on? And so we designed these experiments where we would go, and we'd have to, took us a few years because we'd have to find the water levels right. But whenever we found turtles in a really shallow body of water, we would catch them all, measure them, let them go, and then hide like on the four corners of the pond with little binoculars and watch the banks of the pond for turtles to leave. And we repeated those experiments in deeper bodies of water. And we developed some predictions, and we predicted that the turtles would not do that if the pond had lots of water in it. They would just do what normal turtles do and go to the middle. um, and then, but if the water was real shallow and you caught them by hand, that was kind of the cue. It's not safe, and the turtles would leave. And indeed, they left and did it over and over again. We don't even write it down anymore. It's so common. If you catch a turtle in a pool, an adult especially, and when you let that turtle go, it's gone. 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, it's not going to be there the next day for sure. And I've had turtles walk across my feet as I was packing up my measuring kit. I had a turtle walk right across my feet, leaving the pond, the pool that I just put it in. And we argued in the paper that it was just, that was it. When you caught them by hand, they perceived that as an attempted predation event, and they deem that as it's no longer safe in the water and I'm gone. And I really kind of think that these turtles use these shallow habitats at some high risk. They come down there, they get what they need, and they go. They don't stick around the whole time the water's there. They're just feeding, hydrating, mating, and getting out of there, because it's much safer buried up under the leaf litter, 50 meters up the hill. And we've had lots of turtles. This last trip, we found 3 turtles that pretty clearly had been eaten by a bear. We think they were just, cut in half, kind of, and all the soft parts pulled out. We can't think of any injury that would do that to a turtle. So we think bears, coatis, maybe some various kinds of zone-tail hawks maybe might go down there and forage in those pools for snakes and turtles. And so it's dangerous. And when we catch them, that's what they think.
Right. I mean, what does the life of a Sonoran mud turtle at your study site kind of look like? They're aestivating for a large portion of the year, and then the water comes, and they're entering ponds, and they're moving a lot between these ponds. Is it do they really have a home range, or does it kind of shift a lot?
Well, I think the females are much more um, faithful to a home range than the males. And I think some males are. We found that there's this class of wandering males that change drainages, make these long movements. Most of them are males. We've had, so I think what the life of the Sonoran mud turtle is like is it's very difficult to go from the egg to a hatchling to a survivor of your first winter. If you can survive your first winter, you've got a pretty good chance. If you can survive your second winter, you're pretty good. And then, somewhere in there, you go from a very unlikely to survive another year to very likely to survive another year. And we have now, so in 1994, we caught, I think, 40 turtles. At least 15 of them are still alive. And they've been there all along for 31 years. And they were all, or mostly all, already full-size adults that haven't grown much in the last 31 years. So if you get to be a certain size, and it may be the size when you can close your plastron, which is about, I think if I remember right, 70-ish millimeters, just before you're an adult. And you can, when you can close your plastron, maybe that gives you a little bit of protection against certain predators and also maybe a little better estivation capacity. You live for a long time if you get to be a certain size. But like I said, we found 3 adults this year that we're pretty sure a bear got. So there's no size and you're safe from a bear. But we've still got these ancient turtles that are just still looking fine. They're holding their mass. They're looking like, they're hanging in there pretty good. And they're at least 40 years old.
Well, and from a conservation perspective, I guess you think about that connectivity, these certain transient adults, that sort of thing. I mean, how much do they matter to the population? What's the critical amount of connectivity between habitats that you need? And how do we best conserve these kind of diminutive turtles that not a lot of non-turtle biologists appreciate?
Well, I think the connectivity is important. The way I look at it is, so we're trying to raise money to restore this drainage that right now has almost no turtles and almost no water. It has like 6 impoundments, maybe 7, and they're all dry. One of them holds water. The other 6 almost never hold water. And we're trying to raise money to restore them. And so we're eyeing 2 target species, common leopard frogs and Sonoran mud turtles. And there's discussion about, releasing common leopard frogs into these newly restored tanks. And my argument is we don't need to do that with Sonoran mud turtles. They'll find it just fine. If we want to really, accelerate the rate of population formation, we could throw some hatchlings in. But I think that because of the way that they move, they'll be fine. They'll find it. Males will probably find it more faster, so there might be a male bias sex ratio for a while. But there's turtles hanging on that are still alive that have been adults for a long time and just eking by. If we restored the ponds, those adults would form the basis of the population. Plus, there'd be migrants coming in, and so that's really good news to me. If we do restore the aquatic habitats, there's likely to be turtles there for quite some time, adults that are hanging on, and they move around. So that's all good. Currently, though, every time one of these dams breaks that I was telling you about earlier, that's lessening the connectivity. So it's making the turtles' jobs harder and harder and harder to keep, to reinfiltrate these new populations and to, have gene flow between existing populations. So you can look, and I've got all these maps. If you look at any of our drainages, they've all lost connectivity because of dam failures. So you can just look on the map and say, boy, if you restored that tank, then it would connect this one to that one. And right now, this one to that one's like a 5 mile walk. You can make it a 2 mile walk, and that's more practical for a turtle.
Right. It's a game of sort of habitat restoration more
Yeah,
so than yeah. It's interesting the outsized impact you can have by restoring one impoundment on the others too.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
really interesting.
That's where the connectivity in this system is those little isolated impoundments, making them less isolated.
Right. Well, in the time that you've worked on this Sonoran mud turtle project, I mean, you've got, like we said, over 3 decades of data now. I'm curious, what are the stories that stand out the most? There's got to be some just wild stories from doing this work, and maybe what's the trend that you've seen over time that you find most interesting, if we haven't already touched on that?
Well, yeah, I think the trend over time that's most interesting is the declining aquatic habitats and um, the resilience of this animal, and we've pretty much covered that, I think. And I'm eager to continue to figure out how it unfolds. It unfolds in wacky ways sometimes, and I'm eager to see how long I can last. Some of the wackiest things that have happened to us involve floods, I think, and in particular, in 2004, I think it was. Maybe it was. Yeah, it was in 2004. We were still, we were 10 years in. You'd think we knew what we were doing, but we still didn't really know what we were doing too much. And we camped in this spot. We've always been relatively poor. And so I had a Nissan Frontier pickup truck, 2-wheel drive, and these two students that were with us had like a Ford Frontier, no, a Ford like Focus, like a little compact car, and we managed to limp those vehicles up into our camp, and then it started raining, and so it rained for like 2 or 3 days, and we knew the canyon flooded because we'd seen flood debris in previous years, but we'd never seen it flood. We never, it only floods for a few days a year, and so you don't really see it very often. And so all of a sudden we're sitting there, and it was too wet to catch turtles, and it was raining, and there was puddles everywhere. And then my wife says, "What's that sound? Is that a plane?" And then this other guy says, "It sounds like a train." And it was a wall of water that was coming down the canyon, and we saw it coming plenty of time. But we got out of the creek, and this wall of water 3 feet deep came, and this was a long time ago, and it flowed like that for 4 days, and there was no way to get a car across. There were 3 creek crossings between our camp and the civilization, and we sat there walking back and forth to that creek crossing like 40 times in 3 days, and we were starting to say, they're going to start missing us tomorrow, and we're going to start running out of food the day after tomorrow, and so tomorrow we'll have to start thinking about rationing food. And how long could this go on? And over the years, we've had that happen to us multiple times. Like we call it flooded in. You wake up in the night, you hear the creek running, and you're like, oh boy, we're flooded in, and we know it only lasts a couple days, and it's magical because the next morning all the night hawks are out, and all the deer are running around. Everybody's super happy. It's like the best day of the year for nature, and spadefoot toads are like in chorus and everything. And it was kind of scary the first time, but after that it became kind of, oh, this is super fun. We're flooded in.
That's cool. And some of the work you've done in Oklahoma too, like the long-term mark recapture and assemblage structure, was this study motivated by that, or was it the reverse, or how did this sort of come to be?
Well, so I went to the Palencios for the first time in 1994, and I was still a PhD student in Albuquerque,
Okay.
and I just wanted a break from. I was working on lizards for my dissertation, and I just wanted a break. And these guys knew this cool place where the turtles needed to be studied, and so I went down there. And I went down there 3 times before I left New Mexico. And then I got to Oklahoma, and I wanted to establish a study nearby, and I did. And I worked. That was my main study in Oklahoma for about the first 10 years of the New Mexico study, and I would just kind of sneak out to New Mexico twice a year, and I'd bring my best student or two. Just usually one car, best student or two, and we were just doing mark recapture in 3 or 4 canyons. And I think what happened is I got a really fun student who wanted to do their thesis in New Mexico, and at the same time, this really fun landowner that I worked at their pond in Oklahoma sold their land to a less fun landowner, and I just said, I don't want to deal with this new landowner and keep catching sliders and snapping turtles. Why don't I just turn my attention to Sonoran mud turtles? And so, like around 2004, right after that flood, and that probably helped too. Like, wow, this place is just super cool. I just kind of gradually shifted away from sliders, and I hate catching sliders now. I still have a couple of populations that I once a year or so I catch sliders, and every time I just hate it. They scratch you, and they want to bite you, and they pee on you. And Sonoran mud turtles, they don't do any of that. They just kind of sit there and look at you, and they're a lot a lot easier to work with and a lot funner to catch than sliders. So the slider thing is very fascinating. They're amazing turtles. They're just remarkable, and I um, am so impressed with their ability to get along. And we're having a global turtle crisis, and red-eared sliders are just fine. And that impresses me. I have a I'm impressed. They're really tough turtles, but they're not fun to work on. And if you start working on them, there are like hundreds of them in the smallest pond. So you got a lot of marking to do.
Did you see with the sliders in Oklahoma versus the ones that you worked on at Auburn, was there any difference in the assemblage there or in their movements or
Oklahoma's a lot less rich in turtles, and so most of the Oklahoma farm ponds have really, you can guarantee these 2 things: sliders and snapping turtles. And then there's a few yellow mud turtles and an occasional cooter, which I think gets washed in during a flood, and that's about it. Once in a while you see a snap or a soft shell that also gets washed in. And so in Alabama, you got painted turtles right next to sliders. So you got 2 amiids for sure, and then you've got stink pots, and eastern mud turtles are a little more, I think, prevalent in ponds than yellow mud turtles. Yellow mud turtles are just ghosts out here in Oklahoma. They're hard to find. Um, so it's a much simpler dynamic, but it's got the same basic 2 chiefs of the community: the snappers and the sliders.
interesting? And the common snappers just are pretty habitat generalist around there and not really restricted, I guess.
Yeah, I think you find them. I think in I think we had, like, I don't know, 21 ponds or something. 20 of them had sliders. The one that didn't had a fence around it that was slider proof. And then of those 21 ponds, I think 19 had snapper, something like that. Almost everybody in central Oklahoma, almost every body of water has snapping turtles and sliders that I've encountered. And I
And
think
so
there's so many ponds, and they're snappers aren't as don't think as mobile on land as snapping turtles, but they're enough to find them everywhere.
And so you've done work with growth rings, and that's sort of looking at how accurate that estimation is, like a tree ring, effectively. Was that based on Oklahoma animals? And I
Yeah,
mean, okay,
that
interesting.
was based on sliders primarily. We had this pond where we had really good success catching babies, hatchlings, and then we had really good recapture rates for the hatchlings, and so we had good growth rates, and we could recapture them enough that we could sort of see the growth ring developing, and yeah, they're effective. Growth rings are effective for sliders, but not for very long. For I can't remember what the age is when they become unreliable, but it's like 3 or 4 or 5 years old, something like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. That, like, again, like you said, getting at those sort of basic, interesting biological questions of how many rings did they put on per year?
Yeah.
That creates an interesting study.
So that back to the Sonoran mud turtle, and I told you about that one last year where the little juveniles weren't growing. So we've got 2-year-old turtle, 1-year-old turtles that didn't put a ring on their second year. So it's true. And in New Mexico, we haven't written about the growth rings. I'm still working on it because it's a lot trickier because you could put on 2 very easily if it's a wet winter. Then it gets warm around April 1st. And if it's a wet winter, there'll be plenty of aquatic habitat. And so you could grow until the end of June, by which time the aquatic habitat's mostly gone. It's going to be dry. You'll stop growing, and then the monsoon will come and you'll put on a second ring. Or you could put on 0 rings if it's not a good winter. And then I think typically it isn't a good winter. It's just hold on till the winter, and everybody puts on 1 ring in the monsoon. But if the monsoon doesn't come, then you could have no rings. And so you can have 0, 1, or 2 rings very easily in a year if you're a Sonoran mud turtle. And with sliders, I think it's a little more faithful. You can have 0, 1, or 2, but I think 1 is typical. But then the rings just wear off pretty quick, right? And when they get a little bigger and their growth stops, it's really hard to read it. So they're nowhere near as good as trees, the growth rings on turtles.
Interesting. Yeah, right. It's to a certain point, and then you've got to maybe at the habitat level take in consideration how that's affecting the rate. That all makes sense. Um, with some of your other work, it seemed that you've done some work with the Galapagos, and I'm curious what sort of led to that, and if you've visited the archipelago, what that was like, and sort of what you observed.
So I went to Auburn from the University of Florida, and I grew up in Fort Lauderdale. And when I was finished with Auburn, I wanted to do something different. And so I only applied to places west of the Mississippi River with people that were doing fun things in often other countries. And so my best offer was to go to University of New Mexico and work with this guy Howard Snell, who worked in the Galapagos. And originally the plan was to work on tortoises, but I found out that the tortoises were really hard to work on at the time. They were all, they're not abundant on the coast. You have to hike up to volcanoes and carry your water. And I heard all these horror stories about carrying water up the side of a volcano. And my major professor was working on land iguanas and lava lizards. And so I went down there the first time to try to find a turtle study. And I was going to help him work on lizards and think about, turtles. And I ended up, pretty fascinated by the lizards and by the study he had. He was looking at natural and sexual selection in lava lizards and how the the pressures varied from island to island, and I was really intrigued by that. And he had a great big, mark recapture study, which I was very intrigued by. And I ended up just getting sucked into the lava lizard department. I only saw 2 wild tortoises the whole time I was in Galapagos. You got to work to see them, and we were always catching lizards on the coast. This was in the early '90s, before cell phones and before the internet was widely available. So you went to Galapagos and you were just out there. You had no idea what was going on. It took 6 weeks for a postcard to get to you from the U.S. And so you did not talk to your family, and I didn't know who won the Super Bowl for 2 months one time, and one of my teams was possibly going to be in the Super Bowl. And I kept asking people, and they're like, Super Bowl? We don't know Super Bowl. It was really interesting. I'll always cherish this idea of being so far off the grid that you have no idea what's happening in the world for like months at a time. That was really cool. And you'd come back to the country and you'd be shell shocked for a couple of weeks, just like, wow, there's so many people and these cars are going so fast, and I just don't know what to do. I just need to go home and hide. It'd take a while to get used to civilization again. That's one of the reasons I think I do the Palencios, is that same thing. We go out there, it's off the grid, there's no cell phone service, and you got 2 weeks to just, forget about it.
That's cool. I did a study abroad in Costa Rica for 3 months last year and had a similar. I mean,
Yeah,
there's people, but yeah, you come back to the U.S. and it's just feels overwhelming.
it really is a lot.
Yeah,
And you get out there and it's different, like your head works a little different. You don't think about the same stuff, and then I find when I get back, my head's different for a while too. I need to do it more often than twice a year, because it's so refreshing to to clear your mind like that.
right. Well, as we start to wrap up, there's some kind of general questions just about the adventure side of things that are always kind of interesting to go into. I'm curious, kind of over the course of your work with turtles, what's the trip or the story that stands out the most?
Um, well, there's been several, like, so from an adventure standpoint, I think they're often, so not to tell another flood story. Those are adventures, but there's this place called Pine Canyon, which is this alluring place that we understand is full of turtles, and we've always been allured by Pine Canyon. And so the first time we tried to do it, we staked it out back home on a map, and it was going to be hard, but we thought we could do it. It was like maybe, I don't know, 8 miles from the road to get there. And so me and this other guy, who was a very tough guy, ex-Marine, said, okay, we're going to try the Pine Canyon. And so we hiked for many, many miles, and we were navigating, pretty good, and had a GPS, and we ended up getting there. By the time we got there, there was no water. We'd drinking all of our water, and it was 8 miles from the road, and we caught a bunch of turtles, and then it started getting dark, and we were like, well, we got to go, because it's going to be dark. We don't have flashlights or anything. And we took an alternative route home that we thought would be better, and it was actually way worse. And we got to this bottom of this canyon and looked up, and it was like endlessly high, this canyon that we had to climb. And so we're like, okay, climb this endlessly high canyon. By the time we got to the high canyon, top of the high canyon, it was pitch dark, and we were about 6 miles from the road, and we had our GPS track, So we have 1 bar left on the GPS, and we staggered out of here down this rough trail through canyons, and nursing this 1 bar of the GPS. If the GPS fails, it's pitch dark. We can't see. We're going to have to sleep on the side of the trail. And we made it. We made it out. We hadn't had a drink in like 6 hours, and but we left a canteen in the truck. Stupidly, we should have, of course, carried it too. And so we staggered back out in the middle of the night. These other 2 people that were in camp were sitting there waiting for us, and they were about to call the air rescue or something. We were 3 or 4 hours after dark. It was like 10 o'clock at night, and hey, we survived. We call it the Pine Canyon Death March, and we actually did it in 3 other times. And every time you do it, it's the same thing. You just can't make it out there and catch turtles and make it back safe. You run out of water. My shoes broke. One time we had to duct tape my shoes together. And it's just, it's a great adventure, and you barely make it, and it's not worth it at all in terms of turtle catching, but it's totally worth it in terms of like a great explorer.
Yeah, it's something about the West Coast is a bit different. Like now they've got these life straw gadgets where you can just take these, and if you need a drink, you can get it from the river and it filters it out for you.
Yeah.
East Coast, it's the odds of dying on a trip out somewhere, I think, are lower because
Yeah.
of that sort of thing. But West Coast, I'm from California originally, and yeah, you go out in some of these places and you just, you can't. You have to bring a certain amount of weight, and
Yeah.
it's just, yeah, there's always a shot of desiccation, I guess you could put it like that.
Yeah, we try hard, and we sometimes fail to take enough water, and you know nobody's ever really gotten sick, but we've been pretty hot before, pretty dry.
Right. Well, in terms just to kind of wrap us up, the last thing we're always curious about is if you've got one piece of advice or a few different areas of advice for someone looking to make turtle work a career, what would that be?
Well, I think the first thing would be um, to be um, to be fierce about it. So, like, you can make a career of turtle research. Turtles need people um, to help them, and I think most important turtle questions these days are conservation related. And just at the TSA the other day, I was so impressed with the young people being ferocious. Right, there's like all this ferocious turtle research, mostly conservation oriented. And, I would take my inspiration, I think, from all these young people right now that are just going out there and slogging it out in the jungle for 6 months and coming back with 1,000 turtles and, smiles on their faces. And, what a life that is to just, slog it out with a net full of turtles. It's inspiring, and it's hot and brutal. And I would say the the approach it with fierceness, right? So if you get a net full of turtles, that's always a good thing, even if it's going to be dark after you're done measuring them. And turtles need that from humans, and it's a great fun thing for humans to do. So I'd say embrace that um, opportunity with fierceness.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's a cool way to put it, and I think yeah, cool advice for sure. And like taking inspiration from the meeting too is something that's like that's a whole reason to go to one of those meetings is just to see everything, right?
And you were there, weren't you inspired by all this stuff that's going on everywhere? It's just mind-boggling how much data folks are collecting, and everybody's got
Yeah.
hundreds of radios and hundreds of Nest monitors, and people are going after it. It's really inspiring, and I think the we need to ride that wave of enthusiasm and passion. It's really, uplifting how much attention is being paid to trying to save the turtles. So
It's
get
awesome.
in on that. That's my advice.
Sweet. Well, and we like to sort of finish off with a round of turtle trivia. I don't know if you've got a few random turtle facts you want to throw at us and see
Well, I
if you.
thought about this because you guys said you were going to do that, and
Ah,
I didn't know. I don't have anything super scientific for you, but I do have some turtle trivia. Uh, and how do you do this? Do you want me just to tell you the fun facts, or do you want me to frame it as a question? Or
However you want to do it. We've had people do it every which way, so
so
whichever is.
I am a fan of science fiction, and there's a great science fiction series called Discworld. I don't know if you guys have heard of it. It's written by a guy named Terry Pratchett, and the premise is that the world is on the back of a turtle. It really is, and there's a world floating through space on the back of this turtle. It's like I think a green sea turtle maybe, but of course, a great big one. And there's like 10 or 12 books. I don't know how many in the series. And it's kind of a wacky madcap dash, and I would recommend it as good turtle reading. And then I had 2 Ireland archipelagos that are named after turtles. I'll frame that in the form of a question. What
A
are
question.
the two island archipelagos that are named after turtles?
That's a good question. Huh.
Give up?
yeah, I don't really think I have anything this time.
I las tortugas. I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
The dried tortugas. I don't know if there's a wet tortugas. If there's a dried tortugas, maybe there's a wet tortugas. And the other one is Galapagos.
Huh.
Galapagos means
Oh,
turtle.
right.
Oh, huh.
Kind of fun. And then 3 colleges who have turtles as mascots.
University of Maryland's one.
University of Maryland's one. The other 2 are difficult to come up with. I'm sure you won't know them. I just Googled it. The College of the Florida Keys, their mascot is the tuga, which is a big sea turtle. And then the College of Coastal Georgia, they're known as the Mariners, but their mascot is Salty the sea turtle.
Nice.
That's cool.
Yeah, Maryland has a diamondback terrapin as their mascot.
Yeah. So that's all I had for trivia.
That was a good one. That was fun.
Oh no, I got one more. Stephen King wrote of this turtle called Maturin, Maturin, that is the most powerful guardian of the beams. And this appears in, I believe, in the Gunslinger series and in another of Stephen King's books.
Dark Tower, I think.
Dark Tower, yeah, it's in the Dark Tower, and then I think it might be in It or
well.
Huh?
It's referenced in It as well.
Yeah. So you know about Maturin.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you're a Stephen King fan?
Yeah, a bit of a casual Stephen King fan, but I definitely.
Yeah, me too. I didn't remember the turtle, but I'm a Stephen King fan. So he does that, lacing different characters into different books.
Yeah, he kind of has like a universe that all interlinks. It's interesting.
It's cool how universal turtles are in literature all over the place. You can put the world on the back of a turtle, and it can be this guardian. There's so many different areas that they fall into. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. And I think if you look at a yellow mud turtle or a Sonoran mud turtle and they stick their heads out, you see why, because they're, they've got a certain, look to them.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess we can open the floor to you, Dr. Stone, if there's anything you want to finish off with.
No, I'm glad you guys are doing this, and I hope it went well, and I had fun.
Yeah, this is awesome. Thanks again. And we'll sign off and we'll see everyone in the next one. Thanks for
All
joining
right.
us.